Welcome to the Great Lakes Fishing Podcast presented by Fishhawk Electronics. If you're looking for news, tips, and stories about fishing the Great Lakes, you've come to the right place. And now your host, Chris Larson.
Welcome to the Great Lakes Fishing Podcast. For the past 10 or so episodes, I've been sharing conversations I've had with various folks from the Greater Niagara Sports and Outdoors Show. I've got more interviews from Niagara coming up, but this week I want to bring you, the audience, something fresh and a little different. We haven't done a Lake Huron show yet, so today we're joined by a true veteran of Lake Huron, Captain Ed Retherford from Trout Scout Charters. Captain Ed, thanks for joining the show.
You're welcome, Chris.
Now, you've been on Lake Huron for a long time. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience, your background, your story as it pertains to Lake Huron fishing?
Sure. Well, my grandfather started me back in the late 40s. So that sort of puts me in what age group. But anyways, in the late 40s, but at that time I was only 1 year old and he put me on a boat. But anyways, so they said I was hooked to fishing, and unfortunately he passed away the next year. But my family's always been active in the outdoors, and they were avid trout fishermen on our great stream that we have on this side of the state, the Asabo, which was one of the best trout streams in the Midwest. So in my younger years, I grew up fishing rivers and fly fishing. Then in the middle 60s, I went to college in the southern part of Michigan, and I was a major in biology, actually in pre-med, but I decided to go into teaching, so I went into biology. And at that time, they were just planting salmon in the Great Lakes, and I became very interested in that. Unfortunately, it wasn't Michigan State, but I did contact Dr. Tody and Dr. Tanner at the time and told them I wanted to do a coho growth rate because they just started planting the coho in 1966, and that was right my sophomore year in college. So I got involved in that and did a paper on that, and then the rest was history. I ended up coming to Alpena. I was a football coach and an avid fisherman, and I started guiding on the Asabo in 1969. And at that time, it was, the start of the salmon runs in that river, along with the steelhead and that. And I got involved in what was called at the time the Michigan Guide Association, which now is defunct, but it was there for 5 or 6 years. So I did that, and then took customers in that, and then they planted brown trout in Alpena, and I became involved. Was right in my backyard, so and we became a world famous brown trout fishery, along with the other fishers. And I actually made that sort of my life for 10 or 15 years until the brown trout fishing sort of phased out. But we, at that time I was also boat fishing and back in the. And then I had started full-time in the chartering in the early 70s. So basically, at that time period, I've been at it for 51 years on Lake Huron.
So a long time. Tell us about that paper that you did in the late 60s on salmon growth. What was that all about?
Well, we had to have a paper to graduate. Okay, the seniors did, and there wasn't. It was a small school. It was Olivet, which had very small group of individuals, but in order to graduate, we had to do that. So what I did, I figured, what the heck, I love to fish. So I got on the phone and called Michigan State, and I actually got a hold of Dr. Tanner, who years later, of course, didn't remember that, but he directed me to where the coho were. At that time, it was one of the besides Platte, they were planting them in the Platte River, but it was a Harrietta hatchery. So I drove up there with 2 great big jugs and got like 25 smolt and brought them back to Olivet, had ice in them. And, of course, then we didn't even have an aerator or anything. We didn't figure out how we were going to keep them alive. And put them in a tub, kept them cool enough, and started to grow them. Well, at the same time, they started catching some fish up in Marquette in Lake Superior. some coho during the winter, which I was able to get stomach samples and scale samples. So I actually did a scale read of, from the beginning till they were about approximately a year and a half, and did a comparison on the growth rates and that was a paper. So, and I published that for my graduation. I only made a couple computation errors or calculation errors, but it was well taken in. But again, it was, at that time, nobody even thought about writing anything like that. So.
What went into the decision to start putting coho into Lake Huron?
Well, their decision was that, they planted them in Lake Michigan. They put them here. And at the time, what happened was nobody was really fishing for them out in the lake. Our trolling hadn't really started yet. Everybody was stream fishing them, so they would wait till they came in the fall. And then that was sort of the downfall of the coho. If we talk about coho salmon, that was a downfall of the coho in Lake Huron, was that nobody was fishing them until they came to the streams. So actually they stopped planting the coho, and they started planting Chinook in other places, but they did not in Alpena. But what they did plant was, like I said, in the early and middle 70s, was brown trout. And the way our bay is situated, they just boomed here. I mean, we had, like I said, some of the top brown trout fishing in the world at that time. I mean, there were people that, once they learned of it, came from all over. And then we still had lake trout, and we still had the kings if we moved to them. If we went to where they planted them in the Asavo or Upper Rogers City. And, like I said, I grew with that. But in the 70s, my boat was pretty well rigged for brown trout fishing.
And what happened there? How has that brown trout fishery evolved over the years?
Well, it went gung-ho till the middle 90s. And then, like a lot of things, I was very adamant about keeping the brood stock and, hoping they would. But after so many years in the hatchery, they had to get rid of the brood stock. And the problem was the brood stock that they brought in was actually at that time from West Virginia. And that was, of course, West Virginia wasn't well noted for brown trout, of course. So the fish went from relatively large down to where they were like 7 to 9 pound was an adult brown. So most of us were used to, I got all sorts of photos of fish over, close to over 17 to 24 pounds, at that time period. So that went on. And then in the early 90s, they kept moving around with the different types of fish. And they brought in the sea forellen, which was a sea brown trout from Europe. And that fish was a rapid grower. And it would grow to 20 pounds in 3 years, except it would burn itself out. For some reason, they didn't like that in the hatchery. And that was sort of downplayed. Well, then we started having, if we're just talking about brown trout, we started having invasive species and changes starting happening in the mid-90s in the Great Lakes. And the brown trout plants started to decay or fizzle out as far as survival, and basically they stopped planting them. So that pretty much ended that fishery. But of course, at the same time, I was fishing trout and salmon during certain times of the summer, and kept doing that. And then we had the downfall, or actually the crash in 2004, where the alewife, we actually had the major die-off and the crash from the invasive species of the alewife, which was an invasive species to begin with, but was our basic feed in the Great Lakes, and especially in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And of course, Lake Michigan didn't see that, but we did. And the salmon basically crashed. And when I do my seminars, I just say that I'm a survivor because I stayed here. Because I like I said, over the years, I've had lots of mates. When I was talking to you before because I've done it for so long. And a lot of these kids have turned into captains, and they've moved to other parts. And of course, my kids are actively in the fishing family too. So,
how did that progress, Ed? You said there was a crash in bait fish. How did that evolve from that point to where we are now?
what actually happened was that, of course, the alewife crashed, and we were planting. It was felt we were planting so many fish, and also nobody knew how many fish were actually being naturally reproduced. I don't know if anybody still knows that, because we always argue about it. But the Lake Huron Advisory, which I'm part of, and a group of individuals from all over this side of the state, and along with the DNR officials and different organizations are members, we came to the agreement that we would stop planting Chinook salmon except for a few ports, because number one, they weren't coming back, and number two, the growth rate of them were terrible. But when they crashed, I mean, those fish, they were like 36 to 38 inch long fish, and they were lucky to weigh 9 pounds. I mean, there's been documentations, and I've done other videos and that with video people and that showing what actually happened. And they have great big heads and long bodies and weigh approximately, I mean, they were just starving themselves to death. So we had to adapt. Of course, what our go-to fish at that time was number one, lake trout, and then number two, walleyes. And I became a walleye fisherman, although I'm not considered a walleye fisherman, but I lowered myself to become a walleye fisherman. So I started doing that too. And then along with that, we were still catching a few steelhead, and we had a fairly good mixed bag. And then I don't know if you want to ask, but I can keep going actually to where we are today if you'd like me to do that too.
Please do.
Okay. So we got together and as a group, numerous people, and we talked it over, and the big thing was, how can we bring the inshore fishery without actually harming, and was anything coming back as far as the bait fish population? Of course, us as fishermen, we felt that there was being a rebound of bait fish, but the people that were doing the surveys for the federal government and for the state were saying they're not seeing that huge of a rebound in fish, bait fish I'm talking about, but we were, as far as captains. But again, we're not talking about the entire lake, so it was a pretty tough argument. But there were other fish, because we were looking at, maybe steelhead or maybe brown trout or maybe some other fish we could plant would eat bugs and would eat crayfish and would eat other things. Well, of course, the trout would. The salmonoids, the kings would not eat gobies. Gobies were running rampant over here. Which was the invasive species of choice as far as bait fish, and the lake trout would eat them, but the salmon would not. And that was always the big deal, was that we couldn't get the kings back as far as the plants because there wasn't any bait fish. So we had to bring another fish in. So at the same time, Lake State University in Sault Ste. Marie, they have a gentleman who was raising Atlantic salmon and putting them in the St. Mary's River. And the kids were actually doing basically, what I was doing back in the 60s. They were actually, at this time, though, they had an aquaculture and they had their own lab and they actually had their own little hatchery, and they could actually plant Atlantic salmon. So what we did there, we looked at that, the salmon and the Atlantic salmon, and they eat bugs. They have a lot of characteristics as far as the brown trout did, as far as being able to take the warm water, coming in and spawning, living after they spawn. So they look like a logical choice. So the DNR agreed to plant certain amount in Lake Huron. So that's where we're at today on that. We still have to figure out if that's going to be a success or not, but we are catching them. The problem, as far as me being a fisherman, the problem with me is that, number one, they're salmon, so they're not real predictable on where they're going to be from day to day. So it's not real easy as far as a charter captain to say, I'm going to get up in the morning and I'm going to go out and catch Atlantic salmon, because where they were yesterday, they could be 10 miles away, today. So that's been the case there. But we are trying to develop that, and slowly it looks like it. I got to be cautious because that could change every year. It looks like the smelt, and it looks like our bait is coming back, and we're starting to catch kings now on a fairly regular basis, but not the amount that we did in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. I mean, we were very underrated. I mean, people had no idea how good of a fishery we had on Lake Huron at the time for king salmon. But, when it crashed, we basically were the negative aspect, because when it went, they definitely, it went right down the tubes.
So things are starting to come back, but what are like the challenges that you see right now with Lake Huron that the fishery is facing right now that we have to tackle to kind of get to where you want to be?
Well, number one, the invasive species, I'm talking about, the zebra mussels, and then no zooplankton, because of the larger mussels, the quota mussels were eating zooplankton habitat or eating them, whatever, but they filter. So number one, they feel that hindered a lot of the bait fish from coming back. The alewives, of course, are invasive, so the federal government does not want to have alewives come back, because, of course, that's their goal, and their mission statement is to have a natural Great Lakes, which, of course, us as charter captains don't agree with that, but, that's their goal. But I think it's coming back slowly. But again, with me being a biologist, the zebra mussels change the balance of nature. What it might take nature 10 years to do, I feel that the zebra mussels and the invasive species can change it in 2 years. So that's, quite a shock, in our area. And I think that, some of the other fringe areas, even I'm hearing it right now a little bit about Lake Erie becoming so clean, and even Lake Ontario, which is, that's great because the water clarity is unbelievable, but that also changes the whole balance of nature. Number one, even if you're a novice, fish can see a lot farther. So I don't know if bait fish actually have a chance when they're hatching. I'm sure there's been papers done on it, but, we can see 45 to 50 feet down now, where before you could hardly see a tail of a fish coming up, when I first started. So, that's how drastically it's changed. And of course, I talked to you a little bit about it, and, with all the different staffs that I'm on, that's why temperature and water clarity and actually, going down on some of our rigs, instead of running 5 downriggers, a lot of us only run 2 and 3 now. And, a lot of stuff that, like Fish Hawk does and the temperature people do, and the different graph people that, the different graph people I'm with, we're all aware of, thermoclines and temperatures that, we were aware of back in the 60s. It's just that the technology is so much better now.
What do you see as the future of fishing on Lake Huron?
Myself, of course, I'm winding down. Hopefully I can go another 2 or 3 years. But it is actually coming back, because what we have now, what I actually advertise in my business is we have a variety. I know a lot of people want to come and catch Chinook at one time, kind of deal, but we can catch 7 different species in one day, which, a lot of places can't do that or even advertise that. And, a lot of those guys, a lot of them don't, even like to say that, but, even in our spreads now, I'm catching walleyes in 100 to 150 feet of water because we fish in different areas than we used to fish as far as the water column. So, one day, like I said, I might catch Atlantic salmon, I might catch steelhead, I might catch pink salmon, coho, Chinook, lake trout, so that's quite a mixed bag.
Ed, right now, the whole world is kind of dealing with this coronavirus deal. How has that affected business for you and business for other charter captains in your area?
Oh, we're all shut down. Okay, we've been told by our head law enforcement agency that we cannot charter, and that was up. That came out. I'm going to give you approximate, but you heard, but approximately March 15th or March 20th. That we can't even be. I can't even be near my boat because my boat's on dry land and it's covered. And I talked to my son, and his boat's in lockup. We can't even get to our boats to work on them over here. So, it's very devastating. And of course, this time of the year, like last year, we had all sorts of snow and rain and wind and everything else. And of course, like before the interview started, I'm sitting here telling you I'm watching deer and there's no wind and it's like 60 degrees or 55 degrees here today, and dead calm. That's what they're doing to us now. We're sitting here looking and going, we could be out running trips where normally I'm so far north that I don't run trips this time of the year.
Kind of a tough deal all around, and hope that you guys can keep going and be ready to get back out on the water really soon. Ed, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about today?
No, well, just that it's been a great career, and I met lots of great people, and I always tell my kids if they're traveling and if something happens that if they need somebody to call, that just give me a call and I can connect them with somebody. And like I said, both the boys, Philip, my oldest son, he's a captain, and Paul, my youngest son's a captain, and my daughter, she's probably as avid as they are, and she's got a Ranger, so she's biting at the bit to go fishing, and so like I said, the entire family's down right now, but and along with my mates too. So that's that been around that are captains now. So there's all sorts of people that are down. I mean, it's like we were told, we were warned, that we'd get tickets if we were even close to being out on the water.
Well, if someone is interested in finding out more about you or getting out on the water with you when this is all over, how's the best way for them to find you?
Well, my webpage, www.troutscout, charters.com, or just bring up Lake Huron Fishing Trout Scout. There is another Trout Scout. We sort of laugh about it, but there aren't many of them, so there wasn't a lot of copies. But on Trout Scout 5, my cell phone number is 989-657-2681, and anybody can call me, not just about charters, but if they want to come up here and fish. And the big deal now is Atlantic salmon. A lot of people want to come. It's you got to fish for them. It's not catching. It's a lot like a glory fish or a fish that people want to single out and take off their bucket list. It's not something they're going to catch a lot of.
Awesome.
But it's been nice talking to you, and like I said, I appreciate the call, and I appreciate you asking me to do this.
Thanks so much, Captain Ed Retherford, Alpena, Michigan, fishing Lake Huron.
Thanks for listening to the Great Lakes Fishing Podcast presented by Fish Hawk Electronics. For more information on fishing the Great Lakes, visit our blog at fishhawkelectronics.com.